Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Eric Cheng, and I'm very excited to be sharing my session with you today on monitoring your Canvas Power Apps with Azure Application Insights. And the goal for today is to provide you with an introduction to Azure App Insights and how you can use it to improve the monitoring, logging, and diagnostic capabilities of your Power Apps. And I'll start off by talking about some of the challenges Power App makers are facing today. What are the analytic capabilities and tools that are available out of the box with the Power Platform? And also how App Insights aim to address some of these challenges by providing a much more holistic and powerful application performance monitoring solution. I'll then provide an overview of App Insights and cover how you can provision an instance in Azure all the way through to connecting it up with your Canvas apps. And once we have our Canvas apps talking, we'll then walk through some of the key features of App Insights, including how we can send trace and perform monitoring and alerting within our service. So before we begin, just a quick introduction. My name is Eric, and I'm a digital solutions architect at Komatsu Australia. I've been working with Microsoft low-code and pro-code technologies for over a decade across Office 365, business applications, and Azure. I'm a certified Azure architect, DevOps engineer, Power Platform maker, and trainer. If you do have any questions regarding today's session, please also feel free to contact me via email, social media. You can also find me on the Microsoft Power Automate community forums, where I enjoy helping everyone learn more about Power Platform. So firstly, what are some of the key challenges Power App makers are facing today? And really, if you think about it, some of the challenges we'll be hearing about really isn't that different to what pro devs are facing when we're talking about custom web apps and also native mobile applications. So let's imagine for a moment you're a maker and you've developed your first Canvas app. You've proudly published the application and shared it with a few users with your team. Word starts getting around about how great your app is, and you start getting a few more requests for your app to be shared with other members from other teams. And before you know it, half the organization is using your application. And over time, you're developing enhancements and developing onto your application and publishing these changes to your users as you would. But suddenly, you start getting emails about from frustrated users about your app not working properly. Now, it could be users that are getting strange exceptions, or there's performance issues with your application. Your app, the screens might not be loading, or your app might just be generally slow. And I guess this is one of the first challenges app makers for app makers, and that is everything is reactive. Unless you're constantly using your application and monitoring it 24 hours a day, you're always going to rely on other people to let you know when there's behavioral issues or performance issues with your application. And by that time, it's often too late. So how do makers get and become more proactive about supporting their application so that they can be on the front foot of resolving issues before it snowballs into a much bigger problem later on? So if we continue on our scenario, as any good maker, you decide to drop everything and start troubleshooting your application. So firstly, you want to isolate your performance issues, right? Where do you go to view and access granular performance data relating to your application, down to each screen, so you can identify which part of your application is actually degraded? Next, you want to troubleshoot and fix those errors your users are complaining about. Errors which might be only happening intermittently or during a particular time in the day. So you quickly open the app, you try to replicate the issue, but you can't get the error to pop up. So where do you go to access logs and traces so that you can look back at an earlier point in time when the exceptions did actually happen, so you can work on resolving them quickly and effectively? So I hope by now, I've highlighted some of the key challenges makers and developers in general are facing when their apps suddenly scale and they find that they need the tools and insights to help them support the application quickly and easily. And on the topic of tools and insights, let's actually see what's available out of the box with the Power Platform, because Power Platform by default contains some very useful tools and analytics. And I think it's very important to actually understand what they are, because they may be more than sufficient for your needs, especially if you've got a smaller team or you've got a smaller user base. Conversely, you might turn around and say, you know what, I need that extra level of granularity in terms of visibility of my apps, or I need those extra features that allows me to be a lot more proactive in alerting me of issues with my application. So with that said, let's go and switch over to my Power App portal and actually see what's available out of the box. So I'm in my Power Apps portal right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on apps, and I've got a number of different apps here. So we're just going to select one of them. And at the top in the navigation, you'll notice there's a monitor section and also an analytics section, which is in preview. And we'll briefly talk about both of these. So if I click on analytics, and sometimes it doesn't load on the first time. If that happens, just do a refresh of your screen and it usually will display. But it looks like it's okay. So in analytics, you've got the performance of the analytics of your Power Apps coming in over the last 30 days. And these, your analytics will be displayed via Power BI. So if you're familiar with Power BI and how to slice and dice your data on visuals, you'll be right at home. But the analytics of your application will be separated in usage, performance, and location. So in usage, we can see things like how our users are using our application. What platform they're accessing it from. Is it on a PC? Is it on a mobile device? And are they using the web player, or are they using the native mobile app? We can also see things like, for example, how many times our users have launched our application, and also our daily active users and the version of player or the app player that they're using. And this is particularly useful. It might give you some insights into, maybe your users using an older version and they need to upgrade, or conversely, they might be using a much later version and they might be breaking changes. If we go to performance, again, we see some analytics relating to the general performance of our application. We can see things like, for example, the time it took to load our first screen, the first time our app is launched, and also on subsequent launches. We can also see, the average session time of our users. How long are they spending within our application, and the count of these sessions. And lastly, we have location. And if you've got an application that's spread across a user base across multiple locations, you can see where users are accessing your app. So you can see I'm obviously from Australia. It's close enough. I'm not in the center, but you can see that where our users are accessing your application from. So as you can see out of the box, the analytics is not bad. But if we take a step back and look at the analytics and think about it more closely, it treats our application really as a black box, right? We can't really see inside it. And for me as a developer and as a maker, I might have a business critical application that I need to support. And that application might be more on the complex side with many screens, lots of business logic and API calls. And for me, I want to see a lot more granularity in my details, what's happening within the app, the user flows, how are users traversing my application, what are they clicking on, the time it took to load each screen. And this is all very useful information for me so that I can quickly dive in and isolate problems and start fixing on those problems. And on the topic of troubleshooting and fixing problems, let's look at what is the out-of-the-box capabilities. So there's also a monitor capability as part of the Power Platform. And the monitor capability will pretty much allow you to perform a real-time debug of your application. So on the top here, you can see there's a Play Published App button. And if you click on that, it will launch the latest published version of your Power App. So here, I'll talk about the app a little bit later. You can see it's connected to a debug session. But really, if you start clicking on the different screens and doing different things, you can start seeing the events coming in. And you can see things like the timestamp, the category of the event? Was it a load? Was it a user action? Was it successful? If you've got API calls, you also see status codes, the time it took to perform that action, things like that. So I'm actually really impressed with this particular function, and I use it a lot, especially during the build phase of my application, because it's a very useful tool to iron out the kinks in my apps. However, I think personally, the feature that makes Monitor so great is also one of its main limitations. As you can see, it's real time, so you can only use it when someone or when you are debugging your session or your application. You can, yes, download your events as a JSON file and upload it so you can take a snapshot of it, but there aren't no retention settings. So you can't really save all your logs and your traces and then look back at a time when the error actually did occur. And that's especially useful for me because, as I mentioned before, issues don't always pop up when you want them to. And having sort of that retention is very useful. There's also a few other limitations with Monitor. For example, you can only debug using a web viewer. So for example, if you've got an issue that only happens on a native Android app or the Apple app, you can't really troubleshoot it. So again, just like the analytics we saw earlier, the Monitor capability, which is out of the box, is great. But again, it may be sufficient for your needs. However, for me, I want that history of my logs and my traces over time so I can query that data. And also by having that history of data, I can start doing some pretty cool things like performing anomaly detection, to tell me when my app isn't behaving as it should, and also perform monitoring and alerting on metrics that matter to me. And really for that's really where App Insights come in. So Azure App Insights is a fully managed application performance monitoring service that's in Azure. It's part of a much larger family of services called Azure Monitor, which is a complete topic of its own. And it's all about, providing you with the tools and services and functionality that you need to maximize the availability and performance of your application, from the application itself, the infrastructure, and also the network. Now, it's important to note that Azure App Insights is actually not solely used for monitoring Power Apps. In fact, it's a versatile application performance monitoring service that is or can be used across web, mobile applications to perform things like server-side and client-side monitoring, distributed logging, availability testing, alerting, dashboarding, you name it. So there's a lot you can do with Azure App Insights. However, with that said, what we'll be talking about today is obviously in the context of the Power Platform. So now that we've, covered or briefly talked about what Azure App Insights is, let's go over to our Azure portal and walk through how you would provision an App Insights instance within Azure. Now, before we do that though, if you don't have an Azure subscription, you can go over to portal.azure.com, sign up for a free account, where you'll get $200 US credit for the first 30 days. And after the first 30 days, you'll retain access to a number of popular services for 12 months, and also a range of other services for life. And in terms of Azure App Insights, you get about 5 gigabytes of log ingestion per billing account per month included. So it's actually a really good starting point and also a really good incentive to get into Azure, start looking at Azure App Insights and start leveraging it with your applications, regardless of whether it's a Power App, web application, or native mobile app. So with that said, let's go over to Azure Portal and provision our Azure App Insights instance. So what you can do at the once you've logged into your Azure Portal is to look for Azure App Insights. And once you click into Azure App Insights, you'll see any other instances that you have, like I have here, that I'll be talking about a little bit later. To create and provision an instance, you simply click on Create, and you'll be taken to the creation screen. So once you get taken to the creation screen, you'll just need to provide a few bits of information. So firstly, you need to specify your subscription. So if you've got multiple tied to different billing accounts, select the one that's right for you. Next, you need to create a resource group or select a resource group. Now, a resource group is really just a container to group multiple and manage multiple related resources together. So you might have a project that has App Insights. You also might have app services. So you might have some web apps or web APIs. You might have some serverless functions like function apps or logic apps. You might have storage accounts. So you can group all those and store them all within the same resource group. That makes managing and also cost management a little bit easier. So for myself, I'm going to go and create a brand new resource group. Next, you need to give your App Insights instance a name. And you need to also select your closest region. So for myself, that's Australia East. Lastly, you need to make a pretty big decision point. So you need to decide whether you want to use classic-based Azure App Insights or workspace-based. Now, historically, it was the classic-based. However, with that said, it is actually being deprecated in 2024. There is a migration path, but if you are, I guess, being serious or looking to be a little bit more serious in using App Insights, probably it might be worth it to actually just start off with the workspace base. The only difference there is you will actually need to create and provision an additional Azure resource. As you can see, the Log Analytics workspace. It's just a centralized log repository for your logs. In terms of Azure App Insights in general, it's really mostly the same. You do get some key benefits, performance benefits. You do get some better pricing tiers, so you can commit to different years and make it reduce the cost. There's also some additional features, as I mentioned, like private endpoints if you don't want to publicly expose it. And there's also things like encryption, so you can have customer managed keys and things like that. Now, if you are provisioning it, it does take a lot longer. So for the purpose of our demo and in the context of what we're going to be talking about, it's exactly identical. So I'm just going to go with the classic. So we're going to go and create our resource and click on create. So whilst that's being created, we're going to switch back over to our Power App. And I'm going to show you how we can then point and connect our Power App over to our newly created Azure App Insights instance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Edit, and it's going to open up my app in App Studio. And whilst that's loading, let's multitask. We're going to go back to our newly created resource, and we just need to copy out one key piece of information, which is this instrumentation key. So this instrumentation key is a GUID. You can see it forms part of a connection string. So if you're, for example, using or intending to connect your App Insights from a web app or anything else outside of the Power Platform, chances are you'll probably need the connection string. And the great thing about Power Platform and the tight integration with Azure is that you can just provide this instrumentation key, and your Power App or your Canvas app will automatically know which App Insights instance belongs to you, and also it's going you want to send your App Insights or your application telemetry to. So we're going to copy this out, and we're going to go back into our Power App Studio. So what we're going to do is on the left-hand navigation, we're just going to make sure we're in Tree View, go to App, and you can see there's a text box here for instrumentation key. So we're just going to paste that in. And if we go to File, you'll notice that it doesn't actually allow you to save. So by specifying that instrumentation key, it doesn't really detect the change. That's cool. We can simply just move something around. For example, our logo, go back here, go to Save. And then once that's saved, we can go and publish our change. So that's pretty much it. We've now connected our Canvas Power App to Azure App Insights. Now, if you're following or you get to this point and you go to your newly created Azure App Insights instance and start looking for your data, Just be aware that according to Microsoft documentation, it can take up to 30 minutes from the time you sort of use your app, and also data to start appearing in Azure App Insights. So it isn't really instantaneous. There is a bit of a delay. Now, with that said, from my experience, I've sometimes seen longer, but mostly it's usually around a 10 to 15 minute mark. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So I guess, again, in the true spirit of all live demos, I'm going to go and switch over to an existing instance that I've created earlier that will contain some historical information which will be relevant to our walkthrough. So this particular Azure App Insights instance is connected to another Power App. So it's really the same Power App, but it's obviously one which I've instrumented a while back, and it's already going to be sending information to that instance. So I'll just quickly walk through what this app does to give you some context. It's a very simple Power App. It's a Canvas app which has 3 screens. There's a name screen, and what basically the name screen allows you to do is just type in the name of a particular Pokemon, hit the search button, and it's going to call a custom connector, which will call a Pokemon API. It's a freely available API that returns information about, different things about Pokemon. So if I type in another Pokemon, you can see it will return the details like the image and specific attributes. So in the second screen, I've got an image search. And basically how this screen works is I can pass in the URL of a particular image, as you can see here, and it's going to, again, call another API, do a reverse image search, and give me some details about that particular Pokemon. So this one obviously takes a little bit longer because I've actually got a serverless function or logic app behind this, and it's obviously going to need to spin up. But the app itself isn't really important. I just wanted to show you and perform some actions. So if we go back into the name screen and delete the name and hit search, you can see it's going to throw an exception. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy out my correlation ID, and I'm going to use this a little bit later. So now that we've talked about our Canvas app, let's go back to Azure App Insights and walk through some of the key features. So the first thing that I want to talk about are logs. So logs are important because it's where all your application telemetry that's coming in from your apps is stored. So you can see, if I just clear some of this screen up, different tables on the left-hand side, depending on what metrics are being stored. Now, there is actually one thing I want to quickly point out, and you'll notice this a little bit later on, is that I mentioned earlier, Azure App Insights is pretty much a platform agnostic application performance monitoring tool. You can use it with Power Apps or Power Platform, custom web apps, custom mobile apps. As such, there's going to be some features which won't be relevant to us in the context of the Power Platform. Things like, for example, live metrics, which requires you to use the actual SDK. Things like, for example, failures, because it logs exceptions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So there will be sections within Azure App Insights where there will never be won't be data coming through. So in Azure App Insights, we have something called Custo query languages, which is a query language very similar to SQL. And using Custo queries, you can then query the information within each of these tables. So if I do a run on just the page views table, we can see things like the timestamp, an identifier, the name of the screen, the URL, duration. So details about my application. You can see it's also featured engineered some additional columns. So based on the duration, it's automatically classified it with a performance bucket. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that what you see here actually drives the other functionality within Azure App Insights, for example, to performance metrics. So if I go over to traces as an example, I can hit run, and we're going to see similar information, but traces are custom messages that I'm sending from within my application. So you can see we've got the time, we've got the message, and we've also got the custom dimensions. And I can actually just zoom in and drill down into the custom dimensions and see what I'm actually sending. So yeah, I'm sending things like the app name, and depending on whether it's an error or not, the severity rate and things like that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and paste in this Crystal query, and what this Crystal query will do is it will go and query my traces table. It will look for traces with a severity level of 3, which is an error, and it will look for the correlation ID within my custom dimensions property with that particular GUID. So this is the GUID I actually copied out earlier. So if I hit run, you can see I clicked it twice, but in the previous example, so you can see I've got 2 traces. So it allows me to quickly and easily correlate or find the issue at that point in time. So obviously, we don't expect you to always have to write these queries. And the great thing about Azure App Insights is that you don't necessarily have to write these Crystal queries. For example, you can use transaction search to actually search your logs based on free text. So as an example, I can see all the data of my application over the past 24 hours. I can, for example, type in a particular keyword, and it will return me anything with the keyword error. I can also paste in the correlation ID from earlier and search based on that. So again, it provides a very easy way for anyone who may not necessarily be from a development background to come in here and quickly find issues. So if I click on, for example, this particular trace, this information is straight out of the logs that we saw earlier. But the great thing is I can actually see additional insights about that point in time. If I click on the show timeline for this session, I can see exactly where the user was accessing it from, when, what they accessed it from, and I can also see the timeline of what they've done within my application. So they loaded the app, they clicked on home, search, photo, and then obviously I went back to search to replicate that error. Now this is obviously a very simple app, but if you've got a much more complex app, you can actually see the whole user journey within at that point in time. If you click on show timeline for this user, you can see how many times and also what they did at each of those times in terms of the user accessing your application. So again, it's a very useful tool to pretty much go back in time and try to replicate what that user was doing. So if I go back a few screens, we talked about traces. So if I go and clear out all these filters, you can see there's a number of different categories of events. There's availability that I'll talk about a little bit later. There's also page views. And basically page views, hopefully I've got a few here, is what will be by default sent from your Power Apps as part of the out-of-the-box integration. And by out-of-the-box integration, I just shown you earlier, is by putting that instrumentation key. Now, if you look at page view, you can see things like, the browser version where they access it from in the screen or the page, but and then obviously the duration. But that's pretty much it. So you can't, for me, I want more information. So in order to provide more information, I use traces. So how do I actually send these traces from my Power App? So let's go over back to my Power App, and we're going to go and edit it. And there's a number of formulas or functions within Power Apps that you can use to send trace and also important bits of information back to Azure App Insights. Because as I mentioned before, by default, you'll only get the page views and also some custom events. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go to the search screen. I'm going to click on the button and I'm going to go to the on select event over here. So I'm just going to expand that down a bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm declaring a global variable called var error. I am then calling my API, which is going to be done through a custom connector, and I'm simply passing the value of the text box, which would be the Pokemon name. Now what I'm doing here is I'm using an additional function called if error. Now if error is actually a preview feature. So to use this, you'll need to go to settings. You'll need to go to upcoming features, experimental, and make sure you enable formula level error management. But once you've enabled it, you'll be able to incorporate that within your Power App. And if error is very similar to an if statement. Basically, it's checking if that particular API call in this instance has resulted in an error. And if so, it will go and set that var error global variable I talked about earlier with a message. So here I'm just setting up a default message and also the correlation ID. And we also have a default state or fallback state as well. So after this, I'm just checking if the global variable is blank. If so, I'm using the trace function. And the trace function is what is used to actually send those traces over to App Insights. So I'm passing in the message, I'm passing in a severity level for the trace, and I'm also passing in some details or as a record, as a JSON payload of relating to this trace. So the username, the email, correlation ID, the screen that are on, you can pass anything that you want. Conversely, if the variable is not blank, I'm assuming there's an error. I'm also using the trace, but I'm passing it as a severity level of error. And then I'm also passing a different subset of properties within that record. So that's how you would send traces from your Power Apps over to your App Insights. Now, you'll notice, or you might be thinking, well, there's an exception in Azure App Insights. How come my errors, why don't I send it and log them as exceptions? So the out-of-the-box integration with Power Apps and also App Insights doesn't really log into these exceptions. There are workarounds that you can perform. So you could create a web API or an Azure function, and you can use the REST endpoint or the SDK as part of the Azure App Insights SDK to actually log these exceptions. So, what we've done obviously is a bit of a workaround as well, and we're basically just logging traces with different severity levels. And for what we need, it works. It provides much of that same functionality, but we do lose some of the reporting. So, so that's transaction search. So the next thing that I want to show you are alerts. So I've shown you logs and application telemetries coming in from our application and storing in these tables. Alerts allows us to basically set up rules to monitor all the telemetry that's coming in and trigger an action or notify us when something matches that particular rule. So it could be, for example, we've started to receive some errors, so some high level of trace with errors. It could be slow page loads. If you're doing API calls, it might be a high level of 4XX or 404 errors. So to create an alert, what we can do is go to create and go to create an alert rule. So there's a few bits of information that we need to provide here. By default, the scope would be your Azure App Insights instance within your subscription. The condition is what's going to be your rule. So there's a few things you can do here. You can actually write a custom Custo query, okay? So I might say, hey, when the application telemetry matches this rule, do something. Alternatively, I can go and specify different signals or metrics. So things like, for example, the response time, exceptions, page views. I might want to use trace, for example. So I'm going to select trace, and you can provide, if I scroll down, if we can go to split by dimensions, we can basically specify, what part of that metric or which dimension within that metric we want to create this condition for. So here we've got severity level, and what we're going to do is we're going to do severity level of 3, which I know is going to be an error. At the bottom, you can specify whether you want a static or dynamic threshold. Let's make it simple. We're just going to go and trigger this rule when a trace with a severity level of 3 exceeds 1 count. So whenever one trace comes in, it's going to go and trigger this. Now, you can also specify a sliding window. So what it's going to do is it's going to sample and test every minute over the 5 minutes of data. So that's pretty much it. So we're going to go and click on Done. And that's our condition created. Next, you need to specify an action group. So this is where you specify who you want to notify and also some additional actions that you want to perform. So here you can go and create an action group. You will need to just give your action group a name. In notifications, you can specify who you want to notify and how you want to notify them. So you can use Azure Resource Manager roles. So if you're using the identity access management within Azure and you've got people set up within roles, you can email them. Alternatively, you can use the second option, which will allow you to specify an email, an SMS. If you're using the native native mobile app for Azure, you can also send push notifications to that as well, and you can specify the Azure account, and also voice. So here I'm just going to go and select email. I'm going to give my notification a name, and we're going to go OK, and go to actions. So we specified who we want to notify and how. Now, the great thing about Azure App Insights is that you can not just notify them, you can perform additional actions. So if we have a look here, there's a number of different action types. We can, for example, use Azure Automation. So if you've used Azure Automation, maybe you've got a run book in PowerShell, you can trigger that as well. We can call Azure Functions, Logic Apps, different webhooks. If you've got event hubs, and also if you've got an ITSM, so an IT service management tool, you can automatically create and trigger an issue or a ticket based on issues with your application. So it automates all of that. So we don't need to do that for here, but again, just know that the options are there. So we're going to click on Review and Create. So that's going to create our action group. And the last thing we pretty much just need is to give our rule a name. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a name, just paste in the description. I'm going to specify this as an error. You can specify a few other things, like, for example, enable it by default once it's created, which is what we want to do. And also whether you want to automatically resolve alerts. So what that will do is if, for example, it finds an issue or finds a matching condition, it's going to create an alert. And the next time it samples or it tests it again, if it doesn't find it, it will close and resolve that alert for you. So now that's done. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my Power App, and I'm going to go and trigger some exceptions. So I'm just going to go here, just click it a few times just to make sure that we're going to get those exceptions. And just like before, I'm just going to copy out my correlation ID. So it will take, like I mentioned, 5-10 minutes. So let's move on and we'll come back to this a little bit later. So on the topic of alerts, Azure App Insights also has something called Smart Detection. And Smart Detection are pretty much just like some out-of-the-box rules and alerts that will monitor your application telemetry and let you know when something isn't quite right. So for example, there's slowed page time, long dependencies, degradation of performance, degradation in trace severities, for example. So if I click into slow page load time, you can go to docs to actually find, how this rule works, what it's measuring. But basically, these rules will provide a daily sample of your application, and it will look at the historical data and let you know if it's performing strangely or abnormally, and it will notify you. So just like our alerts that we created earlier, there's an action group that you can set up, and it will perform those for you. So you don't necessarily have to create custom alerts. Again, these out-of-the-box smart detection rules may be suitable for you, but again, just know that you can create custom actions alerts as well. So next thing that I want to talk about is quickly just about availability tests. Now, if you've got a custom web application or a website, availability tests are very useful because you can actually go and perform a test to make sure that your website is up and running, and also you can do things like synthetics and just make sure that you can click on things and you're getting the correct response and things like that. So I might have an e-commerce site. I can go and perform a checkout, add a particular item into a cart, and just make sure that it's all working as expected. Now, obviously with Power Platform, it's a little bit different because it's all managed for us. So I have actually set up some availability tests based on the application. Usually what will happen is, I guess, if you did fail this availability test, it means that Power Platform is probably down. So again, I'm just highlighting what the purpose of this availability test is. So if we move on, the last thing that I want to talk about is the usage section. And the usage section contains obviously information or application telemetry about the usage of your application. So if we click on users, for example, it's going to just obviously collate the data, but you can see in the last 24 hours, it's going to bring up some visuals and also give me some insights into my application. And you can switch it up in terms of the visuals that you want to see. But if I click on view more insights, you can see based on the telemetry over the past 24 hours, there were X number of users across 9 sessions, 42 events executed, and also, the performance was unacceptable. But you can also adjust that AppDex index configuration as well. But if we scroll down a bit, we can start to see some important insights, where the users were accessing it from, operating system, browser, and we can actually start adding additional things like the city they accessed it from, the device type, the result code, a whole bunch of other properties, as well as custom properties. So it's very similar to things like Google Analytics, which you can start creating a picture of how your users and what type of users and where they're accessing your application from. And there's just some other sort of out of the box insights like your top 5 users or your most active users. But the thing that I want to show you is this user flow. So user flows allows you to specify an initial event, and let's just extend the time range. But it will allow you to basically see how your users are traversing your application. So if I go and create this graph, you can see over the past 14 days, I think I set it to, how your users are moving between your screens within your application. Now, obviously, this application only has 3 screens. It's very simple, but you might have a more complex application. And using this particular user flow, you can start to see how your users are landing on your home screen. What's the ratio of these users accessing different screens. So you can see from here, I've got 27 sessions in the home screen. Some users went to photo, some went to search, and some just closed the application. So if you've got users, you've got a screen and, users are having issues accessing or finding that screen, you can come in here and actually see how they're actually accessing it. And by using this, you can actually start making a lot more better design decisions to improve the user experience and also the design of your application. So you can also start using this to see how users are accessing it. Again, similar to the timeline we saw earlier to diagnose your application. So with that said, let's go back to our transaction search and let's see if our alert has been raised or has been created. So if I go and do a search for this particular ID, nope, yes. You can see the 6 events. So obviously, you can see these errors have come through. So if I go back to alerts, we can now see we have 1 new alert. So the alert, if I click into it, will provide me details into which rule was fired, and also what the conditions were that fired the rule. And if I go into my emails, I would have received an email. And similarly, if you had different notifications, SMS, or different actions like an API webhook, it would have triggered those as well. So I can see things like, what time the alert was fired, and also previously, this was yesterday, what time that was fired. So I can start getting a picture of how often this rule has actually fired. So if I'm starting to see things like, in this example, trace errors, I can start seeing, I'm getting a big uptick in errors, or I'm getting a big uptick in performance degradation. I can be a bit more proactive in resolving those issues and getting onto it before users really start complaining about issues with my application. So with that said, let's go back to our PowerPoint. That really concludes my presentation for today on monitoring your Canvas Power Apps with Azure Application Insights. I hope you found it interesting and informative. And again, thank you again for including me in this the Azure Community Bootcamp. There's a lot of great sessions in the 2 rooms, so make sure you go and join the other sessions. There's some official details, and also this is the speaker code, so make sure you go in to that raffle for the prize. Thank you.